Hi everyone, I'm Molly Kingsley from Us For Them, and this is the next episode in our new series in which we expose issues that, for whatever reason, mainstream press don't seem to want to cover. So, in May this year, as many of you will know, there was a major UK public inquiry into a devastating health scandal. That inquiry, of course, was the infected blood inquiry. And in it, Sir Brian Langstaff, chairman of the inquiry, who authored its final report, talked about, and I'm quoting here, a lack of openness, transparency and candour shown by the NHS and government such that the truth has been hidden for decades. And I want you to bear those words in mind as I talk to you about today's topic, which is the suppression and obscuration of COVID vaccine harm data. Now, I said this was going to be chilling last week, and it is chilling. So it's also being picked up on by some interesting people. So in last week's video, I talked about Dominic Cummings' tweet in which he alluded to the need for jail time for senior officials in the US for their part in suppression of the lab leak theory. Now, that was very interesting, of course, in itself. The tweet was also interesting for something else that Cummings said. And what he said, and again I'm quoting, was that he believed that the UK government should publish all hidden data on COVID vaccines to begin restoring trust after the old regime lied and destroyed trust. Now, quite clearly, that's quite a statement, and we believe he's absolutely right. So the whole issue of COVID vaccine harms is a topic that's received far too little candid commentary in mainstream press. And, you know, despite this, it's very clear that the subject of vaccine harms remains of huge interest to many of the British public, us included. And it's no secret that we are seeing any number of worrying health trends in the UK. And in fact, these trends have been widely reported, even if their cause has not. So, you know, just in recent weeks, we've seen articles reporting that cardiac and stroke events in the UK are at an all-time high, that there's been an explosion in cancers, particularly in young people. And, you know, as we know, long-term sickness and disability claims are also soaring. The reporting on these issues is really interesting, as much for what it doesn't say as what it does, because if you went solely on the basis of mainstream reporting, you'd assume that these are long-term trends that result from, you know, multifactorial issues, often very hard to identify issues. So we hear all kinds of things, don't we? We hear, you know, suggestions as to cause ranging from, the pandemic and, you know, NHS closures, huge waiting lists, of course, I'm sure that will be in part a cause, you know, rising obesity, a general lack of fitness, diet, screens, smartphones, you know, even climate change has been attributed as a cause of heart attacks. Now, all of that might be true, and doubtless in some cases is true in part, but of course that paints a very partial picture, and a picture which many of us might say is disingenuous. Because, of course, when you dig down into some of the data sets, what you see, and I am generalising here, but I'm about to show you some specific examples, what you see is often a gradual increase in these negative trends. So, you know, these conditions worsen from perhaps the early 2000s. And then there is a dramatic increase, in some cases a spike, not from 2020 and the pandemic, but from 2021 and the vaccine rollout. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples to illustrate this point. So the first shown here, now this is Scottish health data, and what this shows is the percentage change in cardiovascular incidents in Scotland post-pandemic to pre-pandemic. And what you can see here is, well, actually a decline in July 2020, and then a rise, quite a steep rise, because the change in percentage points is between 0 and 50 percentage points in those cardiovascular incidents from 2021. And that continues, and this data set ends at 2023. Another example, actually from one of the articles I showed just a couple of minutes ago about strokes and long-term sickness. Well, you can see here there is a stark increase in disability and sickness claims that can be traced, again, not from 2020, but from 2021. And, no one is saying, and for the record, I am certainly not saying that the COVID vaccine will be behind all these illnesses and trends, but the COVID vaccine is a known risk factor for cardiac issues, strokes, and of course, more recently, it has been suggested, cancers, particularly in young people. And no one seems willing to have a frank conversation about the extent to which COVID vaccination has contributed to the UK's worsening health. And it's worse than that too, because not only are we seeing a reluctance to discuss this issue, but data sets which might go some way to establishing or not causation are actually being suppressed from the British public. Now, in the UK, we know that mortality data stratified by vaccine dosage and date exists. And indeed, we know it's been given to pharmaceutical companies to support their safety monitoring activities. However, that data has been withheld not only from the British public, but from UK parliamentarians who have asked repeatedly for it. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because UsForThem has been intimately involved in trying to extract this data. Anyway, there's now a significant evidential trail documenting the refusal of ministers and certain public officials to release this data set. And I'm just going to show you a few of the relevant clips that evidence that lack of transparency. So here we have a February 2024 letter sent by 15 parliamentarians to the ONS, the MHRA, the Department of Health and the UK HSA. And in that letter, the members of Parliament said this, and I'm quoting, "We write to you in light of the growing public and professional concerns being expressed about the UK's rates of excess deaths since 2020. The letter asked for publication of anonymised record-level official mortality data which could facilitate a more complete understanding of the causes of excess deaths in the UK and may also enable certain factors to be ruled out. It noted that, incredibly, such data had been shared with the vaccine companies, but not the British public or parliamentarians. And the letter finished by saying, "We and many of our constituents are disturbed by reports that the DHSC, the UK HSA, the MHRA and the independent ONS have not been responding with candour or transparency, nor often on a timely basis to the many serious and legitimate concerns voiced on this topic. Even now, those concerns are being echoed in Parliament." In March of this year, Dame Jenny Harries, she was of course the Deputy Chief Medical Officer during the pandemic, confirmed to Parliament that the UK Health and Security Agency had provided the COVID vaccine manufacturers with official mortality data. But, and this is just unbelievable, she suggested to parliamentarians that the public and Parliament could be denied that data because it was commercially sensitive. Just have a listen to this.
I'm reaching for my piece of paper, and I think the issue. I now understand that the question related to there was a letter which I think has gone to my own organisation. It actually went to Professor Riley, which was why I hadn't personally seen it at that point. So and to the Secretary of State, and I know a formal response will come back to that. I think there were a couple of key points about that. One was about the data that had been shared, and there was a suggestion. I think the UKHSA had shared mortality data sets with pharmaceutical companies. As far as we can see, we'll still do a formal results. We don't routinely share record level mortality data sets that include vaccination dates, doses and or comorbidities with any of the pharmaceutical agencies, and that was I think the main point of the question. We have received a Freedom of Information request on that information, and we're trying to understand what we can and we can't release. And we have released anonymised aggregate data to manufacturers. This is for their own vaccines to support their obligation to report to MHRA as part of the routine safety surveillance. But these data are commercially sensitive.
And it's just so insulting, isn't it? Because it's really hard to see why there would be hesitancy about withholding this data unless it showed a serious issue relevant to a commercial product. And, I really hope that isn't the case. It would be really great if someone from these authorities could confirm if it wasn't the case. And as you can see here, this data, the mortality and vaccine dosage data, has also been the subject of various Freedom of Information Act requests from concerned members of the public. I'm not going to spend too long on this other than to say that some of the responses that have been given by the authorities in declining disclosure really stretch belief. So one of the responses here, the UK HSA considers that disclosure may have negative consequences on the mental health of the families of those deceased individuals to whom the data relates. Now, I find that incredibly concerning, because how could disclosure possibly impact the mental health of families of the deceased unless it indicated a possibility that the vaccine had played a causal role in the death of their loved ones? The final clip I'm going to show you on this data set is back in April this year. Danny Kruger MP. Danny Kruger's been fantastic in speaking up on some of the issues I know you guys care so much about. He also called for the release of this stonewalled excess deaths data. You can see his clip here.
So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these questions are increasingly being asked by the public and being raised in the media. And just to quickly conclude with what I've been doing, and I hope we might get some more answers from the Minister than I've had so far from the government. On the 17th of April, literally a year ago, yesterday is that, 2023, I wrote privately to the Secretary of State asking for evidence that justified the assertion that the government was making, that there was no link between the vaccines and the excess deaths. And I did that because I had so much correspondence from people raising this concern. And I said, I can quickly quote part of my letter. I said to the Secretary of State, I'm writing privately in this way, rather than raising the question in Parliament, because I'm determined not to give credence to unscientific, conspiratorial accusations, nor to undermine the vaccination programme in public if it is indeed entirely safe and effective. So I didn't want to do this in public because I wanted to give the government the opportunity to give me the evidence that I could then pass back to constituents. But I'm afraid the reply I received from the Minister was the one that we've heard already, is this bland assertion that there's probably a combination of factors, flu and old age and so on, that accounts for the excess deaths. And the rest of the letter was all about what the government is doing to combat excess deaths, and the answer to that was more vaccines, mostly. There we go. So I don't think that was good enough. It's taken a year rolled by, the evidence seemed to mount, more and more people raising this concern. So I joined with the Honourable Member and others, including the Member for Shipley, who couldn't be here today, but wanted me to explain that he was on important constituency business, but very much was here in spirit. The Member for Shipley, for Blackley and others, and I, we wrote a public letter this time to the government, asking the same question in more detail, and specifically, what is the evidence for the definitive statement about safety and efficacy? The government says, I quote, there is no evidence linking excess deaths to the vaccine. That is great news. If so, please could we have the evidence on which that assertion is made? And secondly, we asked, will the Department for Health, the MHRA and the UK SHA, the health authority, release the data that is needed to understand what is going on? This data that we are asking for is already made available privately to the pharmaceutical companies for them to use in their safety studies into the vaccine. Why do they get it? Why doesn't the public get it? Why can't independent scientists look at that data? And I'm sorry to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've had no reply to that letter, so I understand it, written in February, and here we are in April, nor indeed to freedom of information requests that went to the agencies as well, months after they were submitted. Have to give way.
And as you can see from what Danny has said, these aren't isolated incidents. And in fact, Danny's clip itself dates from April, so almost 8 months ago. And in that, he says he's been asking this data for a year. So, this is official data which has already been withheld from the public for a period of years. Years. And what is even worse is that even this is just the tip of an iceberg of what's starting to look like a vast exercise to suppress, manipulate, and obscure official data relating to the COVID vaccines. It is absolutely chilling. And I'm just going to end where I started, with the report of Sir Brian Langstaff and the infected blood inquiry, because in his concluding remarks, he reminded public officials, and of course that's public officials today, not those from the 70s and 80s involved in that scandal, but he reminded our public officials of the Nolan principles of public life, and he said those principles are paramount, and these are his words. They emphasise that those holding public office are expected to behave with objectivity, openness and honesty. And I think many of us are struggling to understand why what seems like such a manifestly important data set relating to a product that was given to millions of us, and of course in some cases our children, why that is being withheld. On what possible grounds could it be withheld? And I don't mean here, what technical exemptions under Freedom of Information Act requests or what commercial sensitivities there might be. Like, clearly it is in the public interest to release this data. So please release that data. And, if it isn't released, I guess the words of Sir Brian concluding his report are also relevant. And he concluded that there had been a cover-up in that case, and he said, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead, but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive, and more chilling in its implications. In this way, there has been a hiding of much of the truth, and we have to make sure that a similar public inquiry in 20 years' time from now is not saying the same kind of things about data suppression here. Thank you.